Once again, I want to say thank you to everybody for being here. This is such an important issue. And so, Rachel and Paul, we love listening to you and so respect your courage and your clarity. This European report, which I mentioned at the beginning of the conference, and by the way, I've sent the link to Jim, our host, so that he can put that up so that all of you can see this. But it was just, I think, at the end of last week, the beginning of this week, that this report was introduced. And it basically says that along with the full list of countries, along with Russia, Hungary, Poland, and Turkey, the UK is in a group of the most backward-looking, transphobic countries in Europe, and that we have a real problem around hate language and hate crime. The extraordinary thing is that yesterday I went down to the Labour Party conference and I spoke at an event with David Lammy about justice. That was our theme. David went on in the evening and was interviewed about trans inclusion. And if you look on Twitter, which I advise you not to do right now, you'll see that he's been vilified, lampooned, put down endlessly on Twitter, simply because he asked for equality for trans people, or suggested that that might be a stance that the Labour Party take up. So the complaints and the vilification has come from inside that political party and its leaders, its MPs, as much as anyone else. So my question to you, Paul and Rachel, is why are we in this position as a nation? How did we get here? Rachel, why don't you kick off?
Thanks, Steve. I'm not sure I've got an answer to that. I mean, gosh, there's deep reasons for this. I think one factor to bear in mind, and speaking as someone who's been soaked in feminism for decades, is that there is a wound in feminism around identity. I mean, it's this massive wound, and that there are different discourses. And I think that gets played out massively. But if I can speak to the David Lammy situation specifically, one of the things I'm very clear about is justice cannot be found through a keyboard. I think part of what's at stake here with the violence that goes on in social media is there's an absence of relationship. And I think that one of the things that I've witnessed in my journey as a trans person personally is that when someone actually knows trans people, spends time in our company, that is a kind of, this might be heresy, a kind of converting ordinance, that there's about relationship matters. Justice is never an abstract, it's a relational matter. And we are in such a mess because our bunkers have become ever tighter, that people feel that they are talking to abstracts, that they are just talking about ideas and concepts rather than relating as human beings. The internet is a wonderful and extraordinary thing. We're doing this today because of that, and it does bring us into relationship. But we are, I think, bodies longing for relationships with bodies. We are enfleshed beings, and there is something powerful. There's something powerfully transformative about relationship that flows through every level of our humanity. I think we're in danger of losing sight of that.
Paul?
Thanks, Steve, and it's a great question. Thanks for Rachel's contribution. That for me, it's about fear and it's about power. And it's about the fact that sometimes you can get power if you play on fear. Since 2016, we've seen that across the West. with the election in the United States, with the previous president. We've seen in a whole number of countries, including this one, that if you can mobilize people, if you can invent a word or take a word and make a curse out of it, a word like woke, if you can use that, then people are going to vote for you. And if people are going to vote for you, you're going to do it more. And so there are people in whose interest it is to put wedges between people. And those of us who want to include are therefore straight away having to contend and having to say that's not the way forward. Populism is called populism because sometimes it's popular. And sometimes if you speak out for inclusion, you can be unpopular. And the real issue, as I said in my own talk, is that the people who suffer because of this, people who suffer because of cheap shots in the popular press or stuff on social media, people who suffer are trans people, non-binary people, LGBTQ people, Black people. They're people who, in any case, are on the edge of things. And that is playing on the fact that if people are frightened, it's really good and easy to other people and to push people over there. And this conference speaks for inclusion in a way that many of us on this call are trying to do in every aspect of our lives. But in this area in particular, it is dreadful to hear that if you stick up for inclusion, you're going to get grief from a whole range of different groups who probably don't agree with each other about much, but they've decided to unite around this issue, and people are getting squashed in the middle. That's not right.
It's a huge Copernican type revolution, isn't it? To shift from a binary world to a non-binary world. That's a giant shift in our lifetimes. How can we help people through that big move?
Well, Steve, can I speak into that just for a moment, just to say, I think it is a huge Copernican shift, but I think it's important for us to actually put that in a wider context before we talk about helping people move through that. It's worth remembering that, for example, in Judaism, there is, in the era of the Talmud, 5 genders. That there are other cultural traditions outside of the West that have an honouring of different identities. This is a crisis, actually, I think, if I was going to be really blunt, in the sort of capitalist liberal West. That probably gives you a hint into some of my politics. But in terms of helping people through that, I think partly it is about teaching histories. It's about reminding people that we are caught in a moment that doesn't have to be as it is. In terms of helping people through, I want to come back to the power and the priority of the human. People are suckers for love, Steve. I think they really are. They're suckers for love and humanity and relationship. And just simply to say, listen to the story. Be with someone. Now, as I said, that's very difficult through the line of a keyboard or through a webcam. But the fact that we're doing this here today shows that you can't keep a good God down. Your hope is always there. I think it's about deflating the heat. It's about saying, can we turn down the heat here and be in the cool of the day? Not just to say we're being rational, but just to say, let's listen and hear the story. Let's be in a room together, even if that's a Zoom room.
Paul, as you were speaking, you used the term cis. Can you explain that? Various people have said, what does that mean?
Thanks, friends. I'm sorry. Jargon is an awful thing, and it's cis. That's CIS. I mean, when I use it, it means non-trans. So when I say I'm a cis guy, I grew up as someone who's male. My pronouns are he, him. That's not changed in my life. And that, so it's just a simple use of that shorthand that says that I'm not a trans person and that I've not experienced the non-binary reality in my own body. So that's why I use that word.
Rachel and Paul, Paul, you talked about giving up power, and this isn't about people who are in positions of power helping others. It's about us all working together. But the fact remains that both of you are reverend doctors and are in power, and that gives you a privilege in speaking out, doesn't it? On this conference now, we've got hundreds of people who are working away in schools and in their places of work. They're not on the board. They they don't get a voice. They're on this call because they want to, because of their own situations, they want to support their colleagues, but they don't make the rule book. They don't produce the office manual. What help can you give to people, or advice or support can you give to people in that situation from the days before you were a bishop, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you see a kind of haunted look on the face of bishops, and indeed of the archbishops, and that's because they try and make a difference, and they find it's harder than you think. And you don't get handed levers in the church that you can pull very often, but you do get given a platform, Steve. And I agree with you that platform is important. And one of the things that those of us who support inclusion need to do is to use that platform to speak out. But the difference happens on the ground. And if people on the ground, the folks listening to this call in your own schools or in your own churches or in your own places of work, if you're not making a difference there, I can rabbit away all I like on Zoom or in church, and it's not going to make any difference. So my job is to support you if I can, and to make sure that if you, I often say to the clergy in my own diocese, Liverpool, if you need help, if you're doing a thing that seems unpopular, people are giving you grief for it, refer them to me. Let them chew my ear, because my ear's been well chewed before. And so I kind of want to be a shield for people, but it's not about, I'll do it all for you. It's not about that. It's about realizing and accepting that people on the ground are the ones who make the difference. And if you look at the big changes that have happened in the world or in the conversations that go on within the church or whatever, all of a sudden the middle ground seems to shift. And the reason for that is that people on the ground are recognizing the difference that they can make. We've got Carrie and David on a call. You're going to be interviewing them later on about what it is to be a parent. And their parental experience is what they're talking about. They don't need some bishop to tell them what to think. They know what it's like from their real life. What I can do, hopefully, is clear the areas so that real people can talk. The more of that happens, the middle ground shifts. I'm hopeful about that. Everything I said earlier, Steve, is true about the swing to the right since 2016 in so many different places. That's true, because there's always a battle to fight. But I do agree with Martin Luther King when he said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I want to say to people who don't have a platform, you're the ones who are going to make the difference, not me. And I encourage you in the difference that you're going to be making.
Rachel?
Gosh, I think just talking about my privilege firstly, just to say, I do have an enormous amount of privilege, and part of that privilege for me is to be able to say, and I hope this isn't being reckless, is to say that I am a better target than some others, because it's not just about having my ears bent. I know what it is to have lived in the trenches, but also to have come to be someone who is refusing to throw hand grenades, and to maintain the dignity and love, I hope, and respect, and be peaceable with all. And I'm here with a kind of a willing target, if that's an appropriate phrase. I'm not good at advice, Steve, but I think what I want to say to those people who are working in schools, who are wanting to support children and young people, is to say, please be attentive to their story. Be person-centered, child-centered. Be that person who wants to respect that child's story. Gosh, it can be so difficult, but the truth is I have seen what flourishing looks like when a trans child, when a non-binary child is heard into speech, is given the space to walk into who they are. And this isn't about fighting big battles. This isn't about, standing at the front on the stage at the school, making grand speeches. This is about being the person who says, we believe you, and we also want to create an environment where there is space enough for you to grow, and we will love you and trust you and work with perhaps your bewildered parents. We will learn from you. We will learn from young people and children who are trans. We will give you time and space and grace. And gosh, that is an extraordinary piece of work, which for all my privilege, in my bubble, I do not, I'm not able to offer that in the same way. And gosh, that work on the ground, that is the work of love and justice and mercy.
A question here from Dr. Mark Pickering. He says, building on the language of tolerance and inclusion, which is what you've both been talking about, is there a better word than transphobe for those who may be asking genuine questions from a different place of understanding with regard to gender identity? And he points out this is genuinely, he says, a genuine question from someone who's doing his best to listen and to understand.
I think for me, in the trans space, more than any other, transphobia it has been an accurate phrase because it's about fear. It's about being frightened. And I think what Dr. Pickering's talking about is something else. I think this is about wanting to put your fear aside and just find out. And if someone wants to just find out how complicated the world is, then I don't think it's right that person should be accused of transphobia. The Bible says that perfect love casts out all fear. It doesn't say perfect love casts out all hate, because hate, it doesn't need to, because hate comes from fear. And I do think that conversations in the Church of England at the minute, in the wider LGBTI plus space, the wider sexuality space, we've got conversations going on called living in love and faith. That doesn't mean that nobody knows what they think, but it does mean that you're trying to listen to other people in a way that is without fear. And I strongly agree that we need a space where, if you ask a question, then the transphobic title doesn't get stuck on you from day one. But I can't deny, Steve, that in some parts of the nation and of the West, people do ask questions, but they don't really want to know the answers. They ask questions in order to be contentious, and when that happens, then I think transphobia is the right word to use for it.
I'm not sure I've got much of substance to add to what Paul has said. Simply to say, there has to be a space for inquiry, for exploration. But I want to say once again, let those of us who have privilege and power, it might be ambient power, it might be unconscious power, let's dare to set that aside and listen to those who just are so desperately marginalized and ridiculed and othered, that we allow them to take the lead, because we all know, and I'm certainly not saying this regarding Dr. Pickering, I absolutely hear the force of your point, but there are sadly people out there who will preface something saying genuine question, whereas actually what they mean is, this is a phrase we used to use in the philosophy department at Lancaster: can you please hold this terrible position for me while I attack it for you? And and it's not a genuine question. It's simply attempt to put someone in a box. I'm not sure social media is the place for these tender conversations. For me, face to face is the place to do it. I remember once saying that I'd be delighted to have a conversation with J.K. Rowling, for example, regarding gender critical stuff, and I've been involved in those conversations with many people over the years, but it needs to be, I think, face to face and in a way in which we recognize our humanity first. So I hear your point, Dr. Pickering, and I just hope that we can all find those spaces face to face to respect and love each other into new knowledge.
Just time for a couple more questions, and the first one's for you, Rachel. Somebody's asked, can you explain in a little bit more detail about what you said about the hurtfulness of feminism on trans identity, or to trans identity?
I mean, thanks, Steve. I'm not sure I can do that in 2 minutes, but just to say, I think that I mean, someone who, you know, I'm a feminist myself, but I think it's sort of recognizing that part of the, you know, the challenge with feminism is to recognize there are feminisms, and there are different times and eras in feminism. And I was someone who was formed in the era of feminism which emerged in the 70s, which from the outset said that trans people could not be women or men, you know, in terms of their sort of transitioned identity, which said that basically to be a woman is to be identified and defined by sex, and that's in part to do with biology, but also to do with a category which in which women are essentially used and abused often by men. I mean, if one defines one's feminism in those terms, it actually sort of very much limits the field. What is the case is that since the 90s, there's been a new generation of feminisms, one of which has been black feminism, which has started to talk about, gosh, and we don't want to get into this word, about intersectionality, the way in which identities all come together and sometimes are more powerful than others. And this raises big questions about white feminism, but also a new era of feminism which has said, oh, gender and sex, these terms themselves are really messy and complicated. They're as messy and beautiful as the O in Oasis. So, you know, when we talk about feminism, we have to be really careful and define it properly. So I think that, you know, there's eras in feminism that have been really, really challenging and continue to have their effect and are powerful and influential now in discussions about trans identities and particularly about women's identities.
And just to finish with, before we move on, we talked about the fact that the European Commission, the Human Rights Department, the European Commission, have just marked out the UK as amongst some of one of the worst offenders across the continent. What can we learn from countries that do this well? Who does do this well, and what can we learn?
Well, can I say I'm a great fan of Ireland. What an extraordinary nation that is. And Ireland moved to self-identification for gender quite a while ago. And, you know, the argument that's usually deployed to say, if you allow trans people to make a declaration that they are a man or a woman without medical certification, that's just going to lead to violence and abuse against women. Guess what, Steve? It hasn't. And that's, you know, I just think Project Fear leads to hatred and aggression. We can learn so much from those countries that have been bold, and there are more and more doing it. And it's time we got with the program too.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, the countries I like are countries, the countries that lead the way tend to be small, and they tend to be secure. The countries that are saying, so Russia pretends to be big, Hungary is not very secure. The United States is not very secure, and frankly, the United Kingdom is not very secure. And when people are not secure, they start looking around for people to blame. And the trans community is as it were, a new target, someone to blame. We've got a thing in our diocese called Open Table. It's an LGBTI-friendly community. And when I first went there back in 2014, 15, I met people, trans people who suffered street violence in Liverpool, who didn't dare walk down the street. And that's not because Liverpool is necessarily a place full of hate, but it is a place where if you're going to be frightened, you might as well take it out on somebody different. So it would be great if this nation recognized that it wasn't as big as it wishes it was, and that it was a little bit more secure. And then we might get off that list.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. Thanks, Rachel. Our time is exactly up. I think that's a great start to the day that you both provided for us. So much thought-provoking information and insights that are going to equip us for what we do. We're going to go on through the day and, as you know, get more and more practical about how this actually works in our places of work, in our faith communities and in schools. But you've given us a foundation for which we are very grateful and thankful for your time.